Good morning. This is Steve Onsman. This is the Wednesday Word for the 19th of August. So today's question comes from Carol Badorf. She grew up in our church and is a member of was a member of Calvary for many years. Her mom, Shirley Badorf, still lives here. So thank you, Carol, for this question. Does Jesus ever address slavery? So the word slave in the English version, again, I'm not going to get into the languages, appears 21 times in Luke, 20 times in Matthew, 4 times in Mark, and 3 times in John. The Apostle Paul actually wrote about slavery a lot, or at least he and other writers of the New Testament. But usually it was really more about devotion to Jesus, not about actual slaves. And of course, slave appears in Acts. So it appears a number of times. Jesus uses it in parables, so oftentimes as an example or as a metaphor, like no one can serve two masters. A slave will either hate the one or love the other. But he is also confronted with actual slavery, like the centurion who asked for his slave to be healed. So he saw it, he knew it. In Matthew 28, Jesus tells a terrible story about a slave who is in the higher level of the slave hierarchy, who is going to be sold with his family because he hadn't paid the king what he owed the king. And so he begged for mercy, and the king gave it to him and let him go. Then this very same slave refuses to forgive another slave who owes him money. And seeing this, the other slaves, they were in the lower hierarchy, I guess, go to the king and tell him what happened. So there was conversation going on. So the king then punishes terribly the slave and his family because he refused to forgive someone else, even though he'd been forgiven. All of this was in response to Peter's question to Jesus, how many times should we forgive? And the answer was 77 or 7 times 70. A lot, right? More than just once or twice. So, of course, the lack of any repudiation in slavery is at the source of the Christian embrace of it in this around the world. Paul told slaves to behave well. At least we think it was Paul. It might have been someone adding to it. And he told slave owners to not be harsh with the slaves. He expected them to behave. Jesus never said that slavery was a bad thing or a good thing. And as we see, as I said before, the term slave is in the Gospels 48 times, and the rest of the New Testament only 18 times. And slavery is used 7 times, but never in the Gospels. It's also interesting that Philemon, a short letter about slavery, only uses the term in 1 verse. And Paul begs Philemon to free Onesimus, who is Philemon's slave and is with Paul for some reason. But Paul does address it. And I know I'm getting away from Jesus, but that's how it goes. He does, however, speak about equality in the church, that there is no slave or free. It's mentioned in Colossians 3, Galatians 3, and in 1 Timothy, it tells us that being a slave trader is contrary to sound Christian teaching. In Philippians, Paul describes Jesus as taking the form of a slave. In the parables, Jesus often describes slaves in managerial terms, holding responsible positions. In Genesis, Joseph is sold into slavery but becomes the manager of all of Egypt, even marrying into an Egyptian priestly family. And of course, indentured servitude, kind of like slavery, but only for a short period of time, like Jacob, who wants to marry Rachel and gets screwed over, so he ends up marrying her sister and then Rachel. 7 years of indentured service. It was a common practice for someone who had little means. So while these forms of slavery were a far cry from what we know about slavery in America and in other parts of the world before that, they were still slaves. Slaves had no power and often rebelled in violent ways against their masters, kind of like if you've seen I Am Spartacus, right? The revolt of Spartacus, that was a 2-year revolt from 73 to 71 BC. Jesus obviously knew the way slaves were treated, but it's also important to note that as a member of a nation that was controlled by the oppressive Roman Empire, Jesus was considered little more than a slave, and they could take slaves the common way of punishing them was to do it publicly. And so obviously he had seen this happen. He knew what it was like. I don't think that Jesus would have approved of slavery. I don't think God ever approves of it. But the fact that he doesn't refute it is a problem for all of us. So that's all I can really tell you about it. If you want more about this, I found a really good article called Slaves and Slavery in the Matthean Parables by Jennifer A. Glancy. It's in the Journal of Biblical Literature. You might be able to find it online. It's from spring of 2000. That's Glancy, Slaves and Slavery. Until the next time we're together, have a great day. Thank you.